everybody, how are you? Welcome to Vegetable Gardening 101, Introduction to Vegetable Gardening. And wow, you can grow your own vegetables. We couldn't be better hands than to have Madeline Playhive, as in Beehive, DiNardo, come and help us out today. She is a county agricultural agent too, and is associate professor of Rutgers Cooperative Extension of Union County. If you can put your questions into chat, that's great. And we will get to them at the end. And there probably will be room for everybody to ask their questions. And time will end at 7:30. This program is recorded and will be on YouTube. And we hope you'll share the news with everybody. I just am going to tell you quickly, there are 3 ways to find out more about Union Public Library programs. 1, put your address in chat and get on our email list. 2, check our website. And 3, like us on Facebook. If you live, work, or go to school in Union, come in and get a library card. Very easy. And I really am thrilled. As I said to Madeline before, it was my day off, so I am writing with dirty hands and dirt under my fingernails. Mm-hmm. So happy to have you, Madeline. Thank you very much. Take it away.
Okay, thank you, Debbie. So I'll share my screen here. Okay, do we look good, Debbie?
Looks good.
Okay, great. Okay, well, welcome everyone. As Debbie said, my name is Madeline Playhive DiNardo, and I'm the County Agriculture Agent with Rutgers Cooperative Extension of Union County. And this evening, we're going to talk about Vegetable Gardening 101. So what I'd like to talk about tonight is the different types of vegetable gardens you might want to think about planting. And then a really important part of vegetable gardening is deciding where to put your vegetable gardens. So I'll give you some tips on where would be some good places on your property, or if you're in a community garden, which I know Union has a very good community garden. What are some site considerations like soil testing? How are you going to water the plant? I'll give you a couple of tips on fencing. Then we'll talk about how to prepare the site, how to maintain it once you have all your vegetables planted. And then I figured I'll talk a little bit about some harvesting tips for different vegetables. So that's our game plan for this evening. Now, probably the most common type of vegetable garden is a traditional garden, and that is putting your crops directly into the ground. These types of gardens do have a higher maintenance requirement than, say, a container garden or raised bed gardens, because a lot of times you have a lot more competition from weeds that are growing in the area. Also, a little more effort into watering them. And a very important part of a traditional garden is you really need to do some research on what was the history of the site. Maybe if it's in an abandoned lot, you got to think about things like, well, what was here before? And maybe if it was like a dry cleaning company or some kind of chemicals manufactured, you're going to need to know that in case the soil is contaminated. So it's really good to know a history of the site. And something we always recommend for a new garden is to get the soil tested for lead. Especially if you're in a neighborhood where perhaps there are older homes. If they were painted like pre-1970s, there is a chance that the paint that was used on the house in the past may have some lead content in it. Sometimes if a vegetable garden is located close to a road or a parking lot, even though we haven't had lead in our gasoline for many, many years, sometimes we do find higher concentrations of lead in the soil close to roadways. So I'll talk a little bit more about soil testing for lead in a slide when we get into talking about soil testing. Okay, so Rutgers does have a soil testing service, and it's available through our lab, which has been open throughout the pandemic. So if you go on our Rutgers website here, njaes.rutgers.edu, and click on the link for the soil testing lab, there's a short video on there that shows you how to take a soil test. And then you would, usually for a vegetable garden in the area you're planning on planting in, or maybe it's an existing vegetable garden, you want to dig down about 6 to 8 inches and you can use a small hand trowel, or if you have a soil tube, take some samples. You want to get about 10 to 15 random samples, mix them up in a clean bucket, and then you actually send the lab only about a cup of soil. That's what they need to run the test. But it is really important to take those 10 to 15 samples and mix them all together, because you really want to make sure you get a good random sample of what's happening in the soil. I heard someone say they had a raised bed garden. Maybe if you have 2 or 3 beds, you could take 5 samples from one bed, 5 from another, 5 from the third bed, and mix those all together. Because most of the time when you plant a raised bed, you probably use soil from all the same source. So with the Rutgers, with their standard fertility test, you'll get an email or regular mail if you prefer. Your soil test recommendation will tell you the pH of your soil, how acid or alkaline it is. Most of the time, we like to see vegetables at a pH of about 6.5. So if your pH is too high, they'll tell you how to acidify it. And if your pH is too low, usually the recommendation is to add some lime. So the soil test will tell you that, how you're doing pH-wise. And then it'll also tell you what ratio of fertilizer to use when you're planting. And then usually for most of our warm season crops, usually during the mid-season of growth, usually around like late July, early August, you might want to give the vegetables another small, what we call another application of fertilizer at the mid season of growth. We call that side dressing. So that's what's nice with the soil test. There's a small fee for it, $20, and you would send that in with your soil sample. You would just put the soil in a Ziploc bag, and then you could mail it with the submission forms and your payment. You could either put it in a small box or a big bubble envelope and send it directly to the lab. Another type of garden. Oh, also, I just wanted to mention another thing about the soil testing. If you are going to be testing the soil for lead, most of the time lead accumulates in about the top 3 inches of soil. So when you take your random sample, you're only going to dig down about 3 inches and send that to the lab, and you would let them know that you're just doing a lead test for the soil, because that would be very different than a standard fertility test. So raised beds are very popular for vegetable gardening. Some advantages is that they do tend to be a bit more accessible to people. Since it's a raised bed, you can adjust it to, say, maybe a wheelchair height, or whatever's a little bit more comfortable for people to work with. Just so the width of your raised bed, you don't want to make it any more than 4 feet wide. And the reason for that is you want to make sure that you can reach into the garden bed. So if your raised bed is like a 6 or 7 foot width, it's going to be very difficult to reach into the vegetables that are growing in the middle of that bed. So 3-4 feet wide max is the most you would want for a raised bed. As you can see, it's a very efficient use of space. And what you use for a raised bed, there's a lot of different materials that you can use. Most times people use wood frame for their raised bed. But something to keep in mind, if you're using wood, you want to use an untreated wood. Sometimes with some of the wood products that have been pressure treated to resist rot, the chemicals in there could leach into your vegetable garden. So we recommend using untreated wood. Now, as far as woods go, a lot of times cedar, although it's a bit more expensive, it tends to last a year or two longer than, say, untreated pine wood. So a nice thing about using raised beds is you have a better control of weeds getting into the garden. So maintenance is much easier than your traditional in-ground garden. Another nice thing you can do in a raised bed is you can build a trellis for things like if you're growing string beans that are the climbing varieties or sweet peas. It's just nice and easy to put a trellis in there or A-frame for your vining vegetables to grow up onto. Some things you want to think about when you're putting in your garden, looking at the site, it's easier to put a vegetable garden on a part of your property that's level. In this picture here, you can see there's a little bit of a slope in the area. This is actually at the Five Corners YMCA. So it doesn't look like much, but there was a slope here. So we ended up putting the vegetable garden beds up toward the top of the playground area because that was more level than, say, putting it down in here where we had a little bit steeper slope. Also, you want to make sure that your vegetable garden is in an area that has good drainage, because if you have a lot of water built up in the soil, you could have a problem with root rots, and there's some diseases that vegetables get that are like waterborne fungi. Also, you want to make sure that your garden has good, easy access to potable water for watering. And if it's a community garden situation, or maybe even in your home garden situation, if you're going to be using electric tools or lighting, it's helpful to have an outdoor outlet available. And if your vegetable garden is, say, a community garden site, and there's going to be a lot of people working in your garden, a consideration for a community garden will be where are people going to park? Usually not an issue for a home vegetable garden, but certainly a vegetable garden for a community, parking is something you'll want to think about. So we have our location picked out. We have access to water. The next thing we want to think about is what's the light like in that situation, the sunlight. So most of our fruiting vegetables, like our peppers, eggplants, tomatoes, if we have herbs in our garden, which I heard someone mention when we were chatting before class, or flowers in your garden, those plants need about 8 hours of direct sunlight. Now, if you have a property is a little bit on the shady side, don't worry, there are a couple of things that you can grow. Leafy vegetables like our lettuces, they can grow in 4 to 5 hours of direct sunlight. And your root crops like your carrots, beets, leeks, those need about 5 to 6 hours of direct sunlight a day to do well. Okay, so the orientation of the sunlight, just keep in mind that the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. So the part of your property that's facing south or southeast or southwest, those parts of your property are going to get the most sunlight. Now, let's say if the front of your house faces south and the back of your house faces north, and you're thinking, oh, I have to put my vegetable garden in the backyard. If that's facing north, you might not get that 8 hours of sunlight that you need. So why not consider, you could put your vegetable garden toward the front of the house on the south side, or east or a west side. So your vegetable garden does not necessarily have to be in your backyard. If it's practical for you, maybe you could move it up front or to a side of the house where you're going to be able to optimize the sunlight you have available to you. Another consideration, a lot of us have trees on our property. So if possible, you'd want to try and put your vegetable garden or your raised bed outside what we call the drip line of the tree. So see on the top, we have the tree canopy. And if we were to draw an imaginary line down, that's the root system does spread out further than that, but we'd want to have our raised bed or vegetable garden at least outside that drip line. A few feet more would be even better. Also, if you happen to have black walnut trees on your property, you'll need to not put your vegetable garden in an area where you have a black walnut tree growing. They naturally secrete this chemical called juggulone, and the juggulone is very toxic to some plants, including your tomatoes and peppers. So did you ever notice if you have a black walnut tree, you don't see a lot of weeds and little seedlings growing up around it? Well, that's juggulone is a tree's defense. It kills other plants that it might have to compete with. So black walnut, not the best neighbor for a vegetable garden. Okay. Another thing you want to think about in your site, if you're going to be digging in the ground and you've never had a vegetable garden before, even if your piece of property is not really large, you still need to call 811 or go online to New Jersey One Call and ask them to do a mark out for your property. Because even though you think like, oh, I have a small property, you do still have utility lines like your water line, your gas line. You may have a phone line running in. So when they ask you to call or email or go on their website 3 to 5 business days before you plan on doing your digging. And what they'll do is they'll either send you an email that it's all clear, or they'll let you know that they're going to come out and they'll mark where the utility lines are. Another thing they ask you to do when you call and request a mark out is they ask you to take white spray paint and mark out the area where you plan on doing your planting. So what you might want to do is make your mark out your area that you mark out in the white spray paint a little bit larger than your actual plan. That way, just in case there is a line running in that area, you have a little bit more room to play with to avoid hitting a utility line. Another site consideration is fencing. And we do have a lot of deer in Union County and a lot of other little wildlife friends who like to share the bounty of our vegetable gardens. So fencing is something that you'll want to think about. Anytime you're putting a fence on your property, you do need to check with the town, because towns do have different ordinances about fencing, things like how far back from the property line it needs to go. Many towns have ordinances about how high a fence can be. So you've got to check with your town and get the proper permits for putting fencing in. Usually for deer fencing, you usually need about 8 feet of fencing to really keep deer out. And if your town maybe has an ordinance that you can only make your fence 6 feet high, you might have to ask for a variance. But fencing doesn't necessarily have to be a very expensive proposition. Here's a fencing we did at a Roselle Park community garden. So we had our raised beds, and they had a lot of rabbits and squirrels on the property. So what we did is we put metal posts at each corner of the vegetable garden, raised bed, and then we put chicken wire around the outside of the post to keep the small animals out. Now, anytime you're using chicken wire or plastic fencing, you want to try and get it as taut as you can between your support poles. Because many times if there's a little give in, especially if you're using like plastic netting, the animals might be able to kind of wiggle their way through. So, you know, many times in a home garden situation, the chicken wire will work fine. Okay, here's a picture of our demonstration garden up at Trailside in the Watchung Reservation. And our community garden is 14 by 43 feet. And we put a chain link fence around it. We had some issues with groundhogs, as many gardeners do. So we had some hardwood cleft buried below on the ground and had a regular swinging door gate. So this was put in several years ago, and the cost of the garden was about $2,700. But again, this pricing was a couple of years old. Okay. So hey, how about if we take a little break? Are there any questions in the chat box, Debbie?
I'm going to take a look.
Okay.
Not
If anyone
so
has one,
far.
if you'd like to type one in.
I'll ask a question. Is there anything, if you don't have a fence, that can keep the deer and groundhogs away? Any products or anything?
Yeah, you know, it's very tricky. Like for your vegetable crops, there aren't repellents labeled for use on vegetables. If you wanted to protect like your trees and shrubs and flowers from deer browsing, there are repellent products that are labeled for that. But unfortunately, there aren't many products that are labeled for use on vegetables and edible crops.
So right now we have no questions in chat.
Okay.
So we can keep going.
Okay, great. Okay, so if you're, and it sounds like some of you in our audience tonight are just starting a vegetable garden. So to get it started, if you're doing like that traditional, oh, I see Olivia might have had a question.
Yes, I did. Thank you so
Sure.
much. So far, very helpful. I got tons of questions, but I will limit it. So I saw in one of the previous slides, you're using like the black shade or the black covering, ground covering for the crops. So
Yeah.
I've already planted my crops. So do you have an alternative on what I use?
Yep. Actually, in a couple of slides, I'm
Okay.
going to show you some alternate. So that's a great question, a good lead in.
And one more question. So the chicken wire, because the squirrels that I have, they're like ferocious. They feel like they're part of the family because they come and eat everything, like it's Thanksgiving. So the chicken wire, how does that stop them? Because they can jump, they can fly, they can crawl in.
Yeah, you know, if this would work for you, if you had like the 4 posts and then the chicken wire tight along the sides, would it be feasible for you to roll some chicken wire over the top of that and secure it? And then whenever you need to go in and work in your garden, roll that top off. I would maybe try that. Yeah, try that. Cause yeah, that's the tricky part. In that picture I had, I think we were trying to like close it over with string when we weren't working in there. But if you could put, you know, somehow secure chicken wire to the top, but make it so it's easier for you to take it off when you need to work, I think that would help.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Yeah. Okay, good question. Okay, so we're going to put even if we're putting in a raised bed, the first step you want to do when you're preparing the ground is you want to remove all the plants from the garden, roots and all. So here we see in this photograph, this was a garden we put in on a front lawn, and we used our shovels and we actually like kind of peeled up the grass plants that were growing in the lawn area. The problem was if I had just put my vegetables in there or just built my raised bed over the lawn, eventually the turf grasses, and if there were any weeds in there, they would just be growing up in my raised bed or in my vegetable garden bed. So it is important to, as best you can, to remove all the existing plants from the area, roots and all. Okay. Then, based on your soil test result, we have our bare soil there. We're going to apply our soil amendments. So maybe my pH was kind of was too acid for vegetables, and my soil test result said to add some lime. That's when I would add it. I would put it down with a spreader, and then, or on the opposite side, sometimes I see this a lot in raised beds that use a lot of compost. Sometimes the pH is too high, and you need to add like a sulfur or an ammonium sulfate material and mix it into the soil to help lower the pH. So this would be the time to do it. And then my soil test result would also recommend what type of fertilizer to use. So I would put my fertilizer down, and then I can either rototill everything in, or if it's if it's a small garden and it's practical, you can just take a good shovel and turn the soil over yourself. You don't necessarily have to have a rototiller. But at that point, that's when you're going to want to add your soil amendments. Now, if when you got your lead soil test and it showed that the lead levels were okay for growing vegetables, and you're putting in a raised garden, it's a good idea. You can just till that soil where the raised bed is going to go and use that soil, build your raised bed around it, and then add more topsoil or compost as you need to. As long as the lead came out at an acceptable level, it's a good idea to use the native soil that you have there. Okay. So when you're assembling your raised beds, it's nice to have all your materials together. So it's good to have like drills, your corner joists, and anything else you might need to build your raised bed. A lot of the garden centers, it's nice you can pick up like raised bed kits that have all the materials you need in there. Okay. And then once you've assembled your raised bed, that's when you would fill it with your soil. Now, just a word on filling the raised beds on soil and what kind of soil to use. It is important that you do have some topsoil in there, because topsoils, that's the type, those soils have nutrients in it, and it also has a good structure for the soil. Sometimes people are tempted to just completely fill the bed with a compost material, which the problem with the compost material is it doesn't have a lot of nutrients in it, and the drainage doesn't tend to be very well. You need the structure of the topsoil. And sometimes the straight compost mixes, the pH is kind of on the high side. So if the pH is too high, the vegetables aren't going to be able to take up the nutrients. So make sure you have some topsoil in your raised bed. And one of my last slides, I have the link to our Rutgers website. It's the same website as the soil test in lab one, but we have a good fact sheet on suitable soils for raised beds. It's a fairly new publication.
Madeline, I can include a lot of the information you're talking about today in a follow-up email, so people don't need to worry about writing it down.
Great, that sounds great. Thank you. Okay, so we have our, if it's an in-ground garden, we have the soil all tilled and ready to go. If it's a raised bed, we have our soil in there. We've added any amendments we may have needed if it was an existing bed, and now we want to apply a mulch. And there's a couple of different options. Like you saw in the previous slide, Some people will use a landscape fabric. If you're using a landscape fabric like we saw in that previous slide, that was the black material, you just want to make sure that you get a lightweight one that water can penetrate through. Sometimes you'll see a landscape fabric that's very thick and heavy. Those types of landscape fabrics are meant to like totally suppress weeds. So nothing grows there. So you don't want to use that in a vegetable garden. You want to make sure you go with the lightweight ones that water can penetrate through. Here in this picture, you see we have a red mulch that we're putting, a red fabric that we're putting down. And it's kind of interesting. It's sort of like 50-50 research results. But some studies showed that when the sunlight reflects off the red fabric, that the tomatoes ripened a little bit faster. So those results were kind of 50-50, but some gardeners do like to use the red landscape fabrics for their tomatoes. Now, and here's to answer the good question we had. If you don't want to use like a landscape fabric type material, a good alternate, or if you want to use an organic type mulch, is to use salt hay, like we see in the picture on the left. These are some lettuce plants growing in a salt hay. Now, sometimes salt hay is a little bit harder to find. It's actually harvested from salt marshes. So it tends to have very little weed seed content, because weed seeds that grow in a salt marsh usually don't do very well in our Union County vegetable gardens. So they tend to be relatively weed seed free for our gardens up here in our county. One thing to be careful of, like, sometimes you see like the hay bales available in the fall for like decorating your house for Halloween or Thanksgiving. Be careful with those bales of straw or mulch, because a lot of times those are actually like alfalfa or timothy or stuff like that, and they tend to be kind of high in weed seed content. Sometimes people ask if it's a good idea to use grass clippings. A few cautions if you do that. One is make sure that there haven't been any herbicides applied to the grass clippings. And another thing that's important to do is to frequently rake them. Because if grass clippings, or if you like to use like shredded leaves or leaves as a mulch, sometimes when they're wet and then they dry, they kind of like cake up, and then it's hard for water to penetrate it. So if you do use leaves or grass clippings, it's important every couple of days go out there and just rake the clippings up a little bit so they don't form that thick mat if it's wet and then gets super dry. Okay. So how about our plants? Well, there's a lot of different options for us as vegetable gardens. Many times people will purchase transplants at their local garden center or nursery. Those are an advantage of using transplants is usually they're ready to go. For example, like tomatoes, we usually plant from either a transplant, or if we do start them from seeds, you need to do them about like 6 to 8 weeks from really this week. May 15th is about the date we can start planting our warm season crops in Union County, because we have to be careful about frost. The problem with starting a tomato seed in the ground now, yes, it's warm enough, but it takes a tomato longer to mature. So if we planted it from seed now, chances are it wouldn't be able to produce the tomato fruits before or get a really good crop before we start getting the frosts in mid-October. So tomatoes we usually put in the ground now as transplants, not as direct seeds. So you can start many plants from seed. And a lot of times if you are going to go the seed route, For our warm season crops, we'd want to do that usually in about March, mid-April. We'll be starting seeds depending on what crop you're growing. And those can be grown in a potting mix. And it's also very handy to have plant lights available if you're starting vegetables from seed. Some plants can be directly seeded into soil. And we do have a Rutgers fact sheet on planting a vegetable garden that lists all the different crops. If it's best to plant them as a transplant, or if you can also direct seed them, and when you would need to start your seeds. So we'll include that with the information that Debbie will be sending you. Okay. So when can I plant my vegetables? I get that call a lot. So for what we call our cool season crops, which is like lettuce, kale, collard greens, those can actually go in about April 15th, our cool season crops. Now with the cool season crop, once the weather gets hot, they're kind of done. But a nice thing about them is in mid-August, we can plant a second crop of lettuce, kale, spinach, things like that. For our warm season crops, those are what we call like our fruiting vegetable crops, like tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, squash, watermelon. Usually we put them in around, for Union County, our last average frost date is around May 15th. So past weekend, this weekend, good for planting our tomatoes and peppers and such. Now for watering our vegetables, did you know most vegetables only need about an inch of water a week? And sometimes though, if your vegetables are growing in a container or a raised bed, you might need to water them a little bit more frequently because they tend to dry out faster than vegetables we have growing directly in the soil. So if your garden is directly into the soil, very handy to have a rain gauge that you can check on a weekly basis, and that will help you decide whether or not it's time to water your crops. If you have a container or a raised bed, probably be good to get in there at a good popsicle stick or really dig down into the soil and see how wet or dry it feels. Now, when you're watering your vegetables, it's best to try to avoid wetting the foliage, because a lot of times many of the diseases vegetables get are spread by our fungal diseases, and how the fungal spores spread are on water droplets. So if you're always overhead watering your vegetable crops and the leaves are always wet, it just makes a good opportunity for vegetable disease to spread. So it's always best to try to water at the base of the plant. You really just want the water going down into the soil. And when you think about it, that's really a lot more efficient too, because you're getting the water directly down into the roots. It's not going to be evaporating out into the air like you would if you were putting an overhead sprinkler on your vegetables. And the best time to water your vegetable garden is early in the day. Okay. A nice option for getting that water down to the roots is to use a drip irrigation system or a soaker hose. That's what we see in this photo here. The soaker hoses or drip irrigation have little tiny holes that slowly release water directly down into the soil. Okay. And weeding your vegetable garden, the best tip I can give you for weeding is frequent cultivations. You really want to make sure you try to get the weeds out while they're small, because it's a lot easier to just pop out a little small weed than a giant weed with a healthy root system. So regular maintenance is really key, because if you can get the weeds out before they're small, it's going to make life a lot easier. Another thing, you always want to weed before the weed sets flowers and sets seeds. because guess what you'll be doing again next year? You'll be weeding the prodigies of this year's weeds. So if you can get your weeds out before they flower and set seed, that's going to make things life easier for you in our summer of 22 growing season. Now there are some pre-emergent herbicides that are labeled for use in vegetable gardens. These products prevent weed seeds from germinating, but make sure you read the label very carefully, that it's labeled for use specifically in a vegetable garden. How pre-emergents work is they prevent the weed seeds from germinating. Once the weeds are up, it's not recommended to use a herbicide in your vegetable garden. We really just recommend hand weeding them out. So if you're involved with a community garden, some things that are good to have handy, or even in your home, on your home property, a first aid kit. It's also nice to have, especially if you're in a community garden situation, a hand wash station, especially the days you're going to be harvesting vegetables. And this is a very easy, quick and easy one to make. This is a big like picnic jug with a spout with the water in it and some paper towels mounted to the top. And we have a little bucket underneath the spigot to catch the wastewater and our soap. It's also nice if you're in a home or community gardening situation to have composting supplies. And actually on our last website too, I have a link for you we have a whole community gardening series with about an hour presentation on composting you might be interested in. It's also good to have signage up in your community garden. So I think I'll take a break now too for some questions before we get into some harvesting tips. So do we have any questions in chat, Debbie?
I'm not at this moment. I did want to ask you, how do you spell saute?
Oh, salt, S-A-L-T. Hey.
Oh, salt. Hey, got it.
Yep, saute. Yep.
Anyone else have any comments, questions? Madeline, keep going. I have a sneaking suspicion when we open up the questions at the end, there will be many.
Okay. All right. So, hey, now some tips on harvesting practices. So number one, the foliage should be dry when you're harvesting your plants. And the reason I said that, if you think back a few slides ago, we mentioned about watering to avoid wetting the foliage. If the plant's wet and you're harvesting, you don't want to accidentally spread fungal spores around. Also, be familiar with your vegetable and what's the proper size to pick that vegetable out for the best taste. And usually early morning is the best time to harvest your vegetables. Overnight, the vegetables build up higher sugar content. So when you pick them in the morning, there's usually a higher sugar content in there than, say, if you harvested it in the evening or in the heat of the summer afternoon. So early morning's best. And when we're harvesting, we want to try to avoid damage to the plant while we're harvesting, actually, accidentally ripping it or tearing it, because we want to keep the plant healthy so it can produce more vegetables for us. So for some crops, to prevent that accidental ripping or tearing of the plant, some crops, it's a good idea to use a good, clean, sharp knife or a sharp scissor to make a clean cut on the plant. So in a few slides, we'll talk about some specific vegetables and where it's recommended that you use a knife or a clean scissor to make that cut. And since vegetables are annuals and their goal is to reproduce themselves, for many plants, the more you pick the vegetables, it stimulates them to produce more fruits because they want to set as much seed as possible. So frequent picking on many plants will actually stimulate more vegetable production. Okay, so we'll start out with what New Jersey is most famous for are delicious tomatoes. So your tomatoes, they can be harvested when they first start to show a pink color, if you're planning on keeping them for a while. And the best way to harvest a tomato is to just gently twist them off the branch. And just a little tip on keeping that great flavor, tomatoes should not be refrigerated. Now peppers, we're going to harvest when they're firm and a dark green, but know what type of pepper that you are growing, because some varieties, the longer you leave them on the plant, that's when you get that nice red color, the orange, the yellow, or even a dark purple color, depending on the variety. And you always want to harvest your peppers when they're dry. If you're growing like a hot pepper variety, you might want to be careful, maybe on the transplant label or on the seed label, it might recommend you wear gloves when you're harvesting, if you're dealing with like the super hot varieties. Now, green beans, if you want the best tasting green bean on the block, you want to harvest them when they're about 3 to 6 inches long, because once they get longer than 6 inches, they tend to be a little bit tough. And when you're harvesting your string beans, you want to be careful not to break the branches, because a lot of times if you can even use a scissor for harvesting your green beans, because they'll send out new beans. Now, watermelon, a lot of people have heard the kind of the tale, like you knock on the watermelon, if it sounds hollow, it's ready to harvest. That might work for you, but 2 other things you could look at to be a little bit more sure. If you roll the watermelon over and look at the bottom, if where it was touching the ground, if that's yellow, then your watermelon should be ripe. And then the second thing to look for, the tendrils, those kind of little curly Q stems at the on the watermelon. If they're kind of dried up or dead looking, then and it slips right off the plant, then your watermelon is good to go, and you should have a delicious dessert that night. Okay. Now, what we have grown in our gardens now, these cool season crops, the kale and the collard greens. Usually you harvest them about 40 days after planting, which, remember we mentioned before, these cool season crops you can usually put in around mid-April. So with our kale and collard greens, we're going to cut them off at the base of the plant, about a 1/2 inch above the soil line. And the greens, you can either bunch them together with a string or rubber band. And the kale and collard greens, it's recommended that you rinse them under cold, potable running water, and you can keep this in the refrigerator. And with your kale and collard greens, you can store them wet. Cabbages. Cabbages we're going to harvest when they're hard and firm, and we want to cut the head right at the base of the plant. Now, sometimes there are some varieties of cabbages, when they get like really big and as the weather gets hotter, you might find that the cabbage head actually splits. That's still edible, but sometimes people want to use the heads that split for, say, shredding up and making a coleslaw. And cabbages should be refrigerated in a high humidity area. Our lettuces, and that's probably what you're harvesting now in your garden if you got a cool season crop in. So our loose leaf lettuce, like we see in the picture here, you want to pull the leaves off before they form a flower shoot. And your lettuce you can store in your refrigerator. Head lettuces, those are like the tight ball shape. You're going to want to harvest them when the head feels firm. And you're going to cut that at the soil level. And if there's any like dead or brown leaves, you want to take them off immediately. Now with our loose leaf and our head lettuces, we don't want to get them wet. Like remember we mentioned before with the kale, we recommended rinsing them in some cold water. The lettuces you don't want to get wet. Then you want to store them in the refrigerator, and then when it's time to make your salad or putting your lettuce on a sandwich, that's when you want to wash it off. Sometimes when you store lettuce wet, do you ever notice sometimes you might see in the grocery store and you bring the lettuce home and there's like a lot of brown on the base? That's from moisture. So we want to try and keep it dry until we're going to wash it right before we're going to eat the lettuce. Now with the lettuce, what's naturally going to happen to the plant as the weather starts to warm up, it's going to send out a flower stalk, kind of odd looking, and it'll set seed. Now that's called bolting, and it's perfectly natural for the plant. There's no way to stop it. But once your lettuce starts to bolt, it's not going to have the same flavor as when it's first growing earlier in the season. Sometimes the leaves can taste pretty bitter as the lettuce begins to bolt or is bolting. So that's perfectly natural for the plant to do that. It's part of its life cycle. But the nice thing about these lettuces and other cool season crops, when the weather starts to cool down again in mid-August, you can plant another lettuce crop, another spinach crop. So you kind of get it two crops in 1 year with new plants. Okay. Carrots, you want to keep an eye on them. You'll see, of course, they're growing underground, but if you check around the base of the green top part of the carrot, most carrot varieties, you harvest them when they're about a 1/2 inch in diameter. And whatever variety of carrot you're growing, it'll give you a recommendation of what's the best harvesting size for that particular carrot. Most of the carrots that we grow here in our northern part of New Jersey are usually the shorter varieties because some are shale and rocks in our soil. They tend to do a little bit better than some of the longer varieties. And very carefully, just take your pitchfork or shovel and just dig along the side of your carrot road and gently lift them up and out of the soil. Okay. Summer squash. These are our zucchini and our yellow squash. And for the best flavor on your zucchini and yellow squash, you really want to just keep them at 6 to 10 inches long. A lot of people like to have bragging rights in the neighborhood for the giant zucchini, and sure, it might be giant, but it's going to be very tough and bitter inside. So if you're growing your zucchini and yellow squash for flavor, most varieties you want to go for that 6 to 10 inch long size. Now our zucchini, they're actually kind of rough at the stem. It's good to use a nice clean knife, and you might want to wear gardening gloves too, because sometimes they can have, depending on the variety, they might have some little spines up there. And then your yellow squash, you can just hand twist them like we were hand twisting the tomatoes off our plant. Yellow squash and zucchini are easily bruised, so we want to be really gentle when we're twisting them, or for the zucchini when we're making that good sharp cut off the plant. And it's best to refrigerate these after harvesting. Now in our photograph here, sometimes they do sell unusual varieties where you get like super long zucchinis and summer squash. Those are fun to try. I don't know how they taste, but they are kind of fun to have in your garden. Okay. There are winter squash. These are like butternut, acorn, and spaghetti squash. These we want to harvest after their skins have hardened, but you got to be real careful. You want to get them off the plant before we have our first frost in the fall. And for Union County, our average first fall frost is usually around October 15th. So if you are growing these winter squash in your garden, I would suggest like beginning of October, start listening to the weather reports for like if they're put out a frost warning, or if you look on the National Weather Service for your town, you know, you can keep an eye on there for when they're expecting frost. So you want to make sure you get your winter squash harvest before that first frost. Since these have a pretty thick stem, you're going to want to use a nice clean pruning shear to cut the stem. And for these guys, you want to leave about a 1/2 inch stem above the fruit, and be careful not to break it. Then your winter squash, you can store them for 3 or 4 months at room temperature. So it'll be nice for your fall dinners. The eggplants, did you know there's actually many different types of eggplants in different shapes and sizes? But the ones we most commonly grow, those dark purple eggplants, you want to harvest them at about 6 to 10 inches for the best flavor. Because just like we mentioned with the zucchini, sometimes if they get too large, it'll get a bitter taste. And since eggplants too can be a little bit kind of spiny at the stem, it's a good idea to wear your gardening gloves and use a good sharp clean scissor to cut the stem off the plant. And for eggplants, it's recommended that you don't refrigerate them. Okay. Then white potatoes. How you know your potato is ready to harvest is the plant above ground is going to start to yellow and die back. So this could be sooner than other crops in your vegetable garden. So keep an eye out for that. And then when you see the plants kind of withered and died back, that's when you want to use a shovel or a pitchfork. And just like with our carrots, we're going to very gently lift them up and out of the soil. And when we're working with their pitchfork or shovel, we want to be careful that we don't accidentally stab the tubers. That's what we call the potato. Then right after harvest, it's a good idea to keep them in a warm shaded area until the skin dries. Because when you pull it up out of the soil, the skin is going to be a little bit moist from being in the moist soil. So let them dry. And then you're going to want to store them in a cool area, but not in the refrigerator.
Madeline, I just want to say, people are asking for the presentation, and also I see you're coming to the end because I want to allow time for questions. So please,
Okay, sure.
please go ahead.
Yeah, okay, so just have our author credits, and on our Rutgers website, that njaes.rutgers.edu, we have this talk. This is actually a combination of our talk on starting a community garden and the beginning of the harvesting and food safety in the garden. So those are all online. We also have the composting talk I mentioned, and there's also a 2-part program on keeping pests out of the garden, insect and disease management. Okay, so here's our website.
And I will give, can I give the whole slide presentation out to people?
Oh, actually, it's already online. Yeah.
Okay, great. So I
Yep,
will give
they
all,
just go to the Rutgers website under community gardening, and it's all there.
okay, I will give all the that information that Madeline has in a follow-up email. Okay, Olivia was asking about the presentation, and so I just want to make sure that she and everybody else will have it. I'm going to officially thank Madeline, and I'm going to quit recording and allow time for questions. So please,
Okay.
I'm opening it up.